1965. Steve Chalke.
Well, thank you very much. I'm just going to turn this on. There you go. Now I hope I'm loud. Whoa. Now, where do I need to stand so I'm not there? All right, okay. Yeah. Great. Well, good evening, everyone, again. It's a wonderful opportunity for me to be with you here. The reality is that every acorn that ever falls into the ground has the potential to become a mighty oak tree. We all know that. This little seed twirl into the ground and falling into the soil can become a mighty oak tree. But the truth is that whether it does or not is all completely dependent on the ground, the soil that it falls into. If the acorn falls into soil that's nutritious and deep and rich and moist, well watered, it will grow, it will develop. But even when it breaks the surface and turns itself into a seedling, it's still dependent on the safety and protection it receives from the trees that surround it. If it's on its own, left in the wind and the rain and the snow to be trampled on, it will die. Only if it's given the right soil and the right protection, the right irrigation, can it possibly achieve its potential. The reality is that human beings are exactly the same. And my task is to talk for a little bit about the youth custodial service, crime, and restoration. And the reality is, in all of that, as we all know, restoration is much more complex and much more expensive than the right protections in the first place. Early intervention works, and the article in the Church Times this last few days is about a project that we're setting up on the Wirral in Greater Liverpool. But as I progress, I'd like to tell you about a project just similar to it that with St Martin's in the Field Church in South, well, just into North London, isn't it? Trafalgar Square, St Martin's in the Field Church. We've set up in South London to do exactly the same thing. Changing the metaphor, our lungs need air. Without air, we just can't survive. Human beings need love. That's the air that they need. And I don't intend, because I'm sure you understand, each one of you, about the breakthroughs in our understanding as the human race in neuroscience, brain science. Brain science is the science of the 21st century. And it's the science of the 21st century because of all we now can understand because of the MRI scanner. Until 35 years ago, the only information we had about the development of a human brain was when good people like yourselves left your bodies to science. And after our deaths, people's brains have been sliced up layer by layer. And all research into the human brain until 35 years ago was done in that way. And then came the MRI scanner in your lifetime, in my lifetime, which has utterly transformed our understanding of human beings, how our brains develop, childhood and adolescent brain development, utterly transformed it. So now we know scientifically what it takes for a child to grow into mature adulthood. Now we know what it takes for that acorn to become a mighty oak tree. Now we know why love is the air that a human being needs. Oasis runs 55 schools. We have 33,000 children in our schools around the country. We only work in socio-economically deprived communities. That's all we do. We run schools in other countries, in the slums of Mumbai, as it's now sometimes called. Everybody flits between the two, don't they? We work in various countries in Africa. We work in one old Soviet country, Kyrgyzstan. We work in their youth criminal justice system. We see time and time again, the way I put it is this: love is the medicine. And if it's not working, you've got to up the dose. And if it still doesn't work, up the dose again. It is love. And in my experience of life and the 40 years of Oasis and my work as a youth minister and youth worker before then, it's only love that I've ever seen work in any circumstance. Question me about that as we progress. The last set of statistics on those leaving the youth custodial service in this country, published, these are the 2023 stats. There are none more up to date than that. 82.9% of all young people leaving the youth custodial system had reoffended and been reconvicted within 12 months. 82.9%, 83% of kids had been reconvicted within 12 months. And of course, data always fibs to us, doesn't it? Because if you extended the research to cover 15 months or 18 months or 2 years, rather than measuring at a year and not doing anything else, you'd find that everybody was reconvicted. And the truth is this: we also play word games. So the department, the Ministry of Justice, get them muddled up with the Department for Education sometimes, the Ministry of Justice, they publish figures about reoffending. But what we're measuring isn't actually reoffending, it's reconviction. I would take a guess that's pretty well informed, because of the children that we work with, that 100% of children, they reoffend within a weekend of leaving custodial care. Because what we do is we ship kids back to the very communities where they are owned by a gang and controlled. We ship them back on the day their sentence expires. We even drive them back to the place where they're being held hostage. When we talk about modern slavery in our country, the biggest form of modern slavery in our society is young teenagers in gangs, controlled by gangs across our society. That is it. So we have to do something differently. The first socialization in a child's life is, of course, their home. That's what the MRI scanner tells us. By the age of 3, I'm sure some of you have done this, you can look at this online, the brain of a child at the age of 3 who's been nurtured, loved, seen, felt secure, whose primary caregivers have been stable and emotionally available to the child, where they've not been ambiguous or ambivalent, but they've been solid and reliable, the brain of that child will look, in layman's terms, like a plump cabbage. You can check it out online tonight. The brain of a child that's been pushed from pillar to post, where they've not felt loved and secure, where their primary caregiver hasn't had the emotional space to give to them and put them first, that brain looks like a shriveled walnut. Already, things have begun to break down in a child's life. And before the middle classes leap in and say, well, do you know, that's the problem with some people. They're not there for their kids, and they don't love their kids, and they don't read to their kids, and they don't get riding pony lessons for their kids, etc., etc., etc. It's a middle-class privilege to have the time to be engaged and involved. Many of the parents of children in Oasis schools are working 3 cleaning jobs just to put bread on the table and to pay the electricity bill and to keep themselves from being evicted. The last time I sat and talked to a parent that has been evicted or has been threatened with eviction by their housing association was at the beginning of this afternoon before I got on the train down here in a project that we run. The problem is that in our country, in the youth estate, in fact, across the prison estate, we lock up the poor. That's who we lock up. Poverty sits at the heart of all of this. We lock up the poor. We lock up those who have known developmental trauma. Perhaps I'll say a bit more about that. We lock up those who are neurodiverse. We lock up those over proportionately who are black. But we lock them up because they're over proportionately poor in the first place. Poverty is the grind. Poverty is the root cause of these things. If you're neurodiverse and you're born into a well-heeled middle-class family with 2 parents that are working, or one that chooses to work whilst one chooses to stay at home, the truth is that the struggles that you have as a child can be overcome. If you need an education health care plan, an EHCP as they call them, you can fight to get it for your child. If the school isn't able to teach in a way that relates to the way your child learns, then extra tuition and extra help in evenings and at weekends that's exciting, education that's in their style rather than a narrow sense in which schools have to teach because they have to teach to the middle is available. But if you're poor, none of that is available to you. I have a really good friend, a Muslim family, who through the lockdowns, I know the mum and the dad and their 3 children well, and I love them. And through the lockdowns, their family fell apart and they divorced. We employ the mum. She's my friend, though. She's not an employee, she is an employee. And they're all devastated about this. But the truth is, they lived, believe it or not, in a 1-bedroom flat in an inner London suburb that was damp. And on the 3rd floor, with no lift up and down, and somebody else at the end of their corridor had severe mental health problems during the lockdown and brandished most mornings a knife so they couldn't get past. And the police didn't know how to cope with it, and the emergency services were overstretched, and CAMS wasn't available, etc., etc. So this little family was squashed into this damp flat through those 2 years. I say to my friend, Cornelia and my wife, we survived the lockdowns. But I got a feeling that if we'd had lived in the conditions they have to endure, our outcomes would have been different. The first socialization in the life of any child is the home. But poverty creates developmental trauma. Overlay poverty and developmental trauma with neurodiversity, ADHD, with autism, with dyslexia, etc., etc. And a child feels that they don't fit. I'm telling you what you know, really, aren't I? And because they don't fit, what happens in the end in school is, well, it goes this way, doesn't it? Your engagement goes first, and your engagement falls apart because you don't get it. It's not because you're daft, but the way of learning has become around books and writing. If I take a little detour and ask, why is that? When David Attenborough comes on the TV, one of my heroes, he's 90 and he's still going, so I can look up to him. But when David Attenborough comes on the TV and talks about biodiversity, we all immediately know we need every inch of that stuff that we can possibly get. When we talk about neurodiversity, half of our population still sees it as a problem that needs to be solved. You can walk into a GCSE exam. I know many children who did this back in June this year, and you will be marked down because you misread the words in the question. Or you will be marked down because you can't spell and your grammar isn't up to it. How far behind the science are we? Our education system, guided by old wives' tales than what we understand in the 21st century of how a brain develops and what a brain is. Just as we need biodiversity to survive, and we've needed it to survive thus far, so we've been reliant, actually, on neurodiversity. We've lived on Earth, everybody questions it now, 200,000 years, 300,000 years. There's new evidence last week that perhaps we're a lot older than that. We've been on the planet for a long time. And Homo sapiens throughout that time have relied on neurodiversity. We've lived in small villages, always, until very recently. And in those small villages, the people that could hunt and run and jump and climb and build and dig and cook were pretty essential to the survival of the village. And it was pretty helpful to have one person at least who could read or like writing things. But with the popularization of the printing press, which only happened in Victorian times, slowly reading and writing became the way that it is. We run something which is called Oasis Restore, which I'll talk about in a moment, although it's temporarily paused. Robert, who's with me, and I were there on Saturday. I'll talk about that, and if I don't, ask me questions about it. But every child that we have with us is neurodiverse. And every child that we have with us comes from a poor background. I sat with one young man for a long time a few weeks ago, just chatting. And at the end of the conversation about his upbringing, he just simply looked at me and he said, "Steve, can you be my dad?" Starved of love, we get into all sorts of trouble because our brains simply do not develop in the way that others' brains do. You'll know about your limbic center, your midbrain, which absorbs all your emotions, everything you see and hear and taste and touch. Everything floods into your brain, your emotional center. And you'll know about your rational brain, your prefrontal cortex. It sits just behind your forehead. It's your management center, but we're not born with much prefrontal cortex, which is why a 2-year-old, I've got 10 grandchildren now. I remember back, or some of you got grandchildren, you've seen this, haven't you? You've got a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old grandchild you love, and 1 minute they're as happy as Larry, and the next minute, because you won't give them an ice cream, they throw themselves on the floor and the world is at an end. They're screaming and shouting because they can't get what they want. And then what you do is you smile at them and say, "Let's go and do this puzzle." And suddenly they're alive again and their mood is completely switched. Do you recognize that? That's because no child is born with much prefrontal cortex. You are externally regulating them. Does that make sense? They can't regulate their emotions and moods. All the emotions flood in, but they've not got this management centre. It's not built yet. It's the last bit of the human brain to be built, in fact, not complete until our mid-20s. The management centre, the judgment centre, the ability to think long-term about an outcome of any particular behaviour. It doesn't exist. So they throw themselves on the floor. The kids that we find in many of our schools now and in Oasis Restore and other projects that we're running, they're 15 and 16 and 17, but they have little prefrontal cortex. Why? Because you have to be externally regulated through love, and love has boundaries to it before you reach the place where you can self-regulate. My wife actually says to me very often, she says, Steve, do you know, the more stressed you are, the more stupid you get. Do you recognise that for yourself? When you're stressed, you say particularly daft things, don't you? You respond to people in ways which you later have to go and apologise for. The more stressed we are, the more stupidly we talk and behave. The calmer we are, the more regulated we are. When you're kind enough to the guy in the queue to get in to buy a coffee pushes in front of you and gets his coffee first, or pushes in front of you in the bus queue, when you think, I need to thump him, but you don't, and instead you say, after you, we congratulate ourselves on our maturity. But here's the thing, I don't want to upset you, but you are the last person on the planet who is responsible for your regulation. Your regulation and ability to regulate has come to you from your parents, from your coaches, from those who've mentored you, from those who've set example to you, from those who have been your role models. We owe our ability to regulate to those who've encountered us. That young man said to me, Steve, can you be my dad? Because he'd been starved of that love. So there's a great opportunity for us in this. Let me talk briefly about Oasis Restore, which is shut at the moment because it was built by the Ministry of Justice. I think this is a well-known story. I talked to a bunch of psychiatrists on Friday, and as I got there, they told me, they said, can you talk about your world-famous doors? Because they've been in the media. The Ministry of Justice built Oasis Restore and gave it to us. But there are three things you need to create a restorative environment. One is staff who are trained therapeutically. The word therapeutic, you know, some of you, because you know Greek, New Testament Greek, therapeutic is simply the Greek word for healing, because it's only a therapeutic approach that can overcome the trauma of everything I've just talked about. Trauma is a transliteration of the Greek word for wounds, which is why you get trauma centres in hospitals. So the children that we work with in Restore have been wounded very deeply. And our job is to work with them in a healing way. And it's love. Love holds boundaries, but it's love that is that medicine. The first thing you need is staff that are trained in that way. The second thing you need is a secure environment. You need your buildings to work for you. The third thing you need is joined up policies from government. And if you've got well-trained staff and a secure environment and great policies, you can do a good job. The issue for us all, as we think about youth criminality and as we think about restoration, is that none of that is really working for us in our society. We're swimming against the tide. The Red Tops announce 12-year-old thug arrested for drug running. Why doesn't the headline say 12-year-old child rescued by police from drug gang? Why doesn't it say that? Because we don't live in a therapeutic environment. In France, the childhood at the age of criminality is 12. In Italy, it's 16. In Luxembourg, it's 18. In Russia, it's 14. In Iran, it's 15 for boys, but 9 for girls. In England, Wales, and Northern Ireland, it's 10. 1 year above Iran for girls. It's shameful. It didn't used to be that way. In English common law until 1998, just before the millennium, a child under the age of 7 was presumed not to be responsible for their behaviours and could never be prosecuted until 1998. After the age of 7, a child was still presumed to be innocent because they were not capable of crime unless a prosecution could prove their intent. Only over the age of 13, 14, could you prosecute a child for a crime. And it was in 1993 that Jamie Bolger, the 2-year-old, was murdered by 2 10-year-olds. And we changed our law. I worked for the United Nations for 8 years as their special advisor around human trafficking. The United Nations says that in no country should you ever set an age of criminal responsibility lower than 14. Why? Because they've done the science, because they've looked at the pictures. But in our country, we are 4 years below the minimum. And it changes the story. So in Luxembourg, or in Portugal, let's talk about Portugal, where the age of criminal responsibility is 16. If a 12-year-old is found running drugs, the headline says, how did we let this child down that badly? What do we need to do to change things? But with our criminal age of responsibility at 10, we just say, thug, lock them up. It's against the science. You need a therapeutic culture that understands that love is the medicine. You need a therapeutic culture that understands that restoration, as good as it is far more expensive and far more time-consuming than prevention in the first place. So we need to begin with young children and ensure that they grow up and thrive through those early years. Because if they don't, in that first socialization in the family that I've talked about, the second socialization in school is very likely, or much more likely, to fail, to go wrong. And if the second socialization in school goes wrong, then the third socialization as they enter the adolescent and adult world is much more likely to go wrong. That's why we lock up the poor. That's why we lock up the neurodiverse. That's why we lock up the traumatized. That's why we disproportionately lock up black children and looked after children. foster children who've been pushed from pillar to post. And it's why we lock up very, very few rich children. We don't live in a society of equality. Talking about outdoors, you need policies that work for you as well. Oasis Restore was built with 187 internal doors that were built by the Ministry of Justice. Well, installed by the Ministry of Justice last August, and slowly growing and working with the children that I've talked about. A month ago, we shut temporarily because it was discovered that all of the secure doors were made of chipboard, which is an extraordinary thing. They look like solid oak, but behind, I can show you some pictures if you like, you find it bizarre. Robert has seen this. Behind the secure looking exterior, they were made of chipboard. They were weaker than your front door, or probably than your lounge door. And so eventually we decided that the only thing we could do, which was an awful thing for the young people that were with us, the few that were with us, because we'd been winding down for a time, because we knew these doors have to be fitted, they had to go elsewhere. You need a secure environment, and you need the right understanding in our society. The third thing you need is other policies that work for you. So, for instance, we have opened, just a little illustration, we've opened the first secure school, Oasis Restore, which is a piece of theology, isn't it? We believe in restoration. Moses said an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, which he got from Hammurabi, the Babylonian king, you know, the sixth king of Babylon. I don't know how many of you have been to the Louvre in Paris, and, you know, you go and see the Mona Lisa. Have you seen the Mona Lisa? Yeah? Did you find it impressive? No. Did anybody go and look at it and say, oh, I'm glad I came to see that? Anybody here? No. Anybody slightly disappointed? Put your hand up. Yeah. Everybody who's seen it, yeah. But you didn't know that you were just minutes from seeing a real wonder of the world. It's just down a couple of floors. It's called the Code of Hammurabi. You know, Moses got the commandments on 2 stones, you know, and you think, did they really write on stones? Well, if you'd have gone down those 2 floors, you can see this huge stone. It's slightly taller than me, and it's got the Code of Hammurabi, the Babylonian king. Hammurabi was a Babylonian king. He's written out his laws on this stone. I'm sure someone did it for him. And one of his laws says this: an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, a bruise for a bruise and a bone for a bone. And guess what? Hammurabi lived 500 years before Moses. So when Moses said an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, no one went, you're kidding. They all went, we know that. That's what Hammurabi said, the superpower of the day. But the big thing about Moses is he said an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, and he stopped. Whereas Hammurabi had said an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, a bone for a bone, a bruise for a bruise, except in the case of a slave, a freeman. Well, he talks about slaves and freemen, and he says an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, which is restraint, isn't it? It's retribution, but it's retribution with restraint. Before it was, you take my eye and I'll just kill you. You take my tooth and I'll have your head off. But Hammurabi says, no, equalize this thing. Except in the case of a slave or a freeman, then you can do what you like, effectively. I'm skipping over, there's more to it than that. But Moses comes along and he says an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, and he stops. It's what he doesn't say that's important, because he doesn't classify people into different categories. Everyone is equal. But then comes Jesus. Moses, of course, lives in the Middle Bronze Age and has a Middle Bronze Age understanding of morality, though he's pushing it forward. Then comes Jesus much later, and he says, you've heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, retaliation. But I say to you, love your enemy. Be like your heavenly Father. This is about restoration and forgiveness. And Oasis Restore, which is the name we gave to it, it's amazing that the MOJ allowed us to do that, but they did. Oasis Restore is about restoration. So we don't have wings, we have student flats. We don't have cells, we have bedrooms. We don't have bars, we have windows. We don't have steel doors, we have strong doors that shut silently without clanging. But we discovered they just weren't built strong. They weren't built to spec. We don't have guards with clanging keys. We have youth workers and teachers and health workers. We don't have convicts or inmates. We've got students. And our message is love. But love with boundaries. That love that helps towards self-regulation. But here's the thing. The illustration. When Restore was set up, it was set up by the Department of Health, the Ministry of Education, and the Department of Education and the Ministry of Justice. They worked on this for years and then gave the job to Oasis. And as we went, I said to them, which I'm not telling tales out of school here, I said, so if we're going to be inspected, we're not a prison, we're a school. You want this to be a school, so we need to be inspected by Ofsted, not by His Majesty's prison inspectors. They said, yeah, that's right. So we need a framework to be inspected in. They said, yeah, that's right. But it never happened. So we get inspected in terms of our education because there is no framework for it. And we exist for 12 to 18-year-olds to work with them therapeutically. These are kids who've never been to school, who've dropped out of school, who've roamed streets, who've been groomed and exploited and joined gangs, who've stabbed people. We only take kids that have committed very violent crime, murder, attempted murder, manslaughter, rape. You don't come to us if you've stolen stuff off the shelves of Tesco's. But here's the thing. When Ofsted first came to us, they said, we don't have a way of inspecting you, so we've come up with the best we can. So they inspect us as though we were a further education college for 16 to 19-year-olds. That's what they inspect us against. So strange thing is, so then we get bad inspections, you see, because these guys say to us, they're friends, they say, you know, we have to inspect you against a framework, and this is the framework. And yet, so we got, you know, so we know what you're doing, but there is no framework, and it's not our fault there's no framework. The government haven't made one. So they inspect us against the framework for further education colleges, 16 to 19-year-olds. But we say, but we've got 12 to 18-year-olds. So one thing they said to us last time, they were there, and we say, and we're open 365 days a year, 24 hours a day. So they say, yeah, but we're here to inspect the education. We said, literally, we had this conversation. We said, so you'll want to come and see these kids getting up in the morning and getting washed and cleaning their teeth and sitting at a table and having a conversation over breakfast. And the inspector said, no, we're here. Oh, we're here. So somebody's ringing me. I'm so sorry. From Oasis Restore, in fact. They said, we're here to inspect the education. And we said, but getting these kids up in the morning because they've never been to school and sitting them round a table and them having a meal and having a conversation and being social and emotional together and developing in that way some prefrontal cortex, that is education. They said, no, it's not. They said, we're here to inspect the education. So they only inspected the classes. And then they said to us, this is honestly true, and I'm not knocking them, because they were inspecting against the framework. So then they said to us, now you only have 63% of your children attending classes. And that's lower than the average for kids that go to further education colleges. And we said, that's because they've chosen to go to a further education college and they're 16 to 19. And our kids have never been to school. They are ghost children to the system. They're not persistently absent. They're not severely absent. They're gone, which is why they got into crime. So we're getting 63% of them there. You should be celebrating that. That's an extraordinary advance. Yeah, they said, but we're inspecting you on the 16 to 19 framework for further education. I use that as a simple example of many other issues I could talk to you about. There is so much that we still need to do. You can't just drop therapeutic answers into a penal system and expect it all to work. We have to change every element of the system. There are 5 minutes to go. I was watching on there. Yeah. And so in that 5 minutes, I wanted to talk a little bit about what you can do. Because the thing in the Church Times just this week for us replicates something that we do in South London. Sam Wells is the vicar of St Martin's in the Field Church. And St Martin's in the Field Church, since 1699, set up by Thomas Tennyson, who became the Archbishop of Canterbury, Archbishop Tennyson, set up a girls' school in South London called St Martin's High School for Girls in Tulse Hill. Tulse Hill in Brixton is, it's high-rise city, it's endless council estates, and it has 3 warring gangs. Upper Tulse Hill, Lower Tulse Hill, Brixton. There's not so much knife crime, but there's a lot of gun crime. There is knife crime as well. And there are huge numbers of children out of school. In one of the local primary schools, the persistent absenteeism rate in the primary school is 38%. 38% of primary school children are not in school. Secondly, all of the primary schools around us tell us this, that by year 5 and 6, that's 9 and 10-year-olds, you can see the children that are being groomed. Softly groomed. And that will just develop as they enter secondary school. By the way, in our country, we don't do transition. We talk about the transition between primary and secondary school. There is no transition. What happens is, on July the 20th, you leave your teacher, your desk, your peg, your classroom, your friends, and all the history of your learning style. And 6 weeks later, you're thrown into a completely different system, in a completely different place, with no history of where you came from. And you're expected to thrive, and endless numbers of children drop out at that point, and then they're absent, and then they're on the estate, and then they're exploited, and then they're groomed, and then they're in the criminal justice system. So what we've done with these school buildings in Tulse Hill, because the school shut just over a year ago, is we've begun what we call an oasis village. And we've invited in all of the grassroots organisations in the community that work with children. You know, those wonderful charities that have only got 1.5 people that work with them, or sometimes they're all volunteers, but they love cooking with kids, or they love dancing with kids, or they love painting with kids, or they love playing dodgeball with kids, or gardening with kids. You know, you've got ones, all right, you know. But they're always broke, and no one cares about them. We say do things with people instead of to them, but then that's just before a bunch of professionals turn up and leave the community out altogether. So what we did in this redundant building is we just invited everybody in. We invited in all of these local charities, and we gave them a room to use as a base. And there's a playing field, and we've given it to local football clubs, a girls' one and a boys' one, to play. And we've created endless things, and all Oasis does is we conduct these groups. And they've flooded in, and they've begun to work with the schools, and without off-rolling any child, we draw children in, or they draw children into what they're doing. You can come and cook, you can come and play football, you can dance, you can learn the guitar, you can learn the keyboards, but everything's educational, and everything caters for diverse thinkers, and everything is a pathway to employment. You can learn about film production, you can learn how to use a camera, you can learn how to take photographs. And here's the thing, because prevention is much better and cheaper and quicker than cure, because in Exeter or your town, there is an empty church building or an empty primary school building or a half-empty primary school building, because the church, I believe, with the buildings it has across the country and the volunteers it has across the country, is the best place to do this thing. No acorn ever becomes a mighty oak tree unless it falls into soil that supports its growth. It seems to me that the calling of the church is to follow the teaching of Christ and wrap people round with love. If we don't do that, we're going to have to keep on building more and more and more prisons, and it still won't work. That's what we have to bring. Hope. I will stop. Amen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Steve. I'm going to suggest that you turn to somebody sitting near you and talk to them for 30 seconds or a minute about what you've heard. People online, if you've got questions that you would like to ask, please either write them in the chat or raise your hand in Teams so I'll know to call on you. Talk among yourselves, share some reflections, and then in a minute Steve's kind enough to take some questions from the floor. So reflect with your neighbour for a minute or two.
I don't know what level to pitch. Yeah, and I don't want to be too Hello again. Thank you. You're very kind. Huh? Oh, yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah, no, that's fine. Yeah. Well, you a note I need about what I'm talking about here. Well, they've stayed. That's a bit. That's
quite famous professor last night talking about crime and murders
I'm going to interrupt your interesting conversations. If you were my students at this point, I would ask if there are any questions and you would all look around and a stony silence would fall. But you're not my students mostly, so that's not going to happen. So I'm sure we'll have lots of questions for Steve. If I can ask you to keep your question as brief as possible so that as many people as possible can contribute. If you would like to, this is not compulsory, but if you would like to tell Steve who you are, where you come from, if you're connected with the university or one of the local churches or elsewhere, I'm sure that would be really helpful to him. Who would like to start us off? Yes, please.
Thank you. My name's Piers Langdon. I live in a place called Hemyock, which is just up the road. You said training is one of the three components that is very important. If you, and we do in our village, recognise the youth, which there are probably 500, are in trouble, and you need training. Where do you get it?
Well, that's a brilliant question. I think, are you part of a local church there?
I am.
So let me tell you a very brief story. I went to open a hall of an Anglican church. I'll tell you where it was. It's called St Andrews. There's lots of St Andrews, aren't there? So I'm giving a number of that. It so happened that 3 weeks before, there was a St Andrews primary school, and the head teacher got in touch with me and said, Steve, could you come in and sit down with us because we've got a real problem. So I went to the St Andrews primary school, knowing that I was going to a church called St Andrews 3 weeks later to open their hall, and discovered that St Andrews primary school was there and St Andrews church was there with a road in between. Well, I sat with the head teacher of St Andrews primary school, and she said to me, Steve, you know, the problem is we can't get mentors. We've got all these young families who need support, and we've got all these kids that need support. We don't have a football team. We'd love to do a gardening project. We need some people to come in and read. She went through this whole list. So I said, no. And I listened to all of that, and we talked about it a bit. 3 weeks later, as I say, I was at St Andrew's Church across the road opening their new hall. The vicar was very grateful afterwards, and all these silver-haired people like me went home. And then we stood looking out of this giant window in the hall, actually looking at the school, but he wasn't focused on the school. And he's a great guy. As we stood there looking out across the road, he just said, musing, he said, Steve, thanks for coming, and it's a wonderful hall, but we got a real problem. And I said, what's that? He said, well, didn't you notice? Everybody here is over 50, over 60. So many of them are retired. What we need is young families and kids. We got the hall. How do we get the people? Extraordinary. Both part of the same diocese. Both with the same name. The school having been started by the parish church with no contact between the two. And each able to solve the problem of the other. So there are all sorts of levels of getting involved. Of course, you can go away and study therapeutic care, and you can study neuroscience and brain development, etc., etc. But there are some brilliant books there out there now, and those can be recommended by others to you, but there really are. But at the softer end of this, what everybody needs in life is someone who spends time with them. Yes. And what you've got as a group is time to spend with these kids. And if you do it through a primary school or a secondary school, you're doing it in a safe environment, because you've got to think about the safeguarding for yourself as well as anyone else. But if you go along and you go to a breakfast, in our schools, we get people from local churches and other groups to come in. We run cafes, and so if you would commit, if a person commits to say, I will come and I'll have breakfast, a cup of coffee and some porridge or whatever it is with this particular child, and I commit myself to do it every Tuesday for an hour at 8 o'clock for a year. That is life-changing for this child, because I can tell you this, I've seen it happen. It's nothing. You don't have to be hip and trendy and wear the same clothes and know who's in the charts and all the rest of it. Use the language. If you just turn up, I've seen it happen so many times. I'd take up too much time telling you stories. But I see children who are difficult in a classroom, who can't sit still in a classroom, who cause disruption. I see them. I see what happens to them. And what's happening to them is they are trying to figure out, why is this person with me? No one's paying them. They're not a social worker. They're not from CAMS. They're not a classroom teacher. Why are they here? They're not a probation officer. Why are they here? And slowly it dawns on them that the only reason you are there is because you want to be. And that's the soil that changes a life. So it's not sophisticated. It's just a case of joining up.
Thank you. Would you mind passing it to...
I don't need a mic.
You will need a
Pentecostal
mic.
diaphragmatic.
I'm going to come and hold it near you.
All right.
Online won't be able
I'll
to hear.
use it.
Thank
And
you.
I won't lick it.
Thank you.
Steve, thank you so much. Joining the dots. When you see the pattern of the universe, when you see the picture, the science, when you see the artist behind the artwork, and yet the system, the frame that is there, as you gave us an example of the kids, the system not understanding what you were trying to do. How do you get the dots joined together when you see, I mean, I know patience, long-suffering, gentleness, meekness, kindness. I know, you know, sometimes you must have come away and gone to Cordelia and said, help!
Yeah. What I would say is this. Last week, I went to the Labour Party conference to speak, invited. I spoke at more things at the Labour Party conference than I can shake a stick at. I can't, this group and that panel, and I was invited on to others. I can tell you what the big issues were there. There's the immigration thing that everyone talks about. And the other big issue in our society is welfare. And as you know, one is triggered by the other. In other words, it's the lack of welfare. It's people feeling dispossessed, left out, forgotten, that wages haven't risen, endless people. More people work in our society for less than the living wage than work above it. It's an extraordinary thing. So people are poor, they feel left out, they don't feel heard, they don't feel listened to. They live in damp housing, crushed housing, there isn't enough housing. And then what you do is you create a totem, don't you? And there are these people coming on boats, by the way, who only represent 3% of the actual immigration into our country. It's tiny by proportion. But here are these people living in hotels. You should go into some of those hotels and find out what they're like. But living in hotels, and they've all got luxury, and we can't get to the doctors, and there's no one coming for us, and there's no facilities on our estate. So what emerged is almost everything I was asked to speak at, and every minister I spoke to or talked to me, it was about how do we create a sense of hope in local communities? How do we bridge the divides? We bridge the divides through connection and belonging and relationship. How do we do that? I am telling you, you can sum up at least 50% of the seminars that took place there and the ones that take place at the Tory Party conference this week around those subjects. Yeah. That's it. So where does change come from? My view, change never. Don't wait for some government minister to bring change. They won't. And that's not a cynical thing, and it's not a political. They're all trapped in a system. I remember speaking at an event with Ian Duncan Smith. Remember Ian? You know, he'd just been sacked as the Tory party leader, we did this a seminar together on child poverty, and he was doing some speaking. I was, emceeing it, etc., etc. And then there was the time for some questions. And somebody stood up, this packed audience, and said, well, if you understand all this, why don't you do something about it? Right? And his reply was this. He stood there in central London, and he said, what can I do? I'm just a government minister. And everyone fell around laughing. But I knew exactly what he was saying. A government minister can't change much. What actually happens if you think about what goes on in our country, change doesn't come from the bottom, because people right at the bottom are dispossessed and have no voice. It doesn't come from the top, because everybody's too busy doing other things. It comes from committed groups of people in the middle who demonstrate different models of behaviour, and then it gets picked up and called. I did very well at the Labour Party conference because we just at the Labour Party conference announced that we were opening this village, like the one at St Martin's, on the Wirral, bringing together local charities. Lisa Nandy, I spoke at a thing with her. She was, you know, because they know they have to activate local communities and the voluntary sector. How do you do it? You know, the education guys there, you know, Bridget Phillipson, they know you've got to get on into persistent absence, into exclusions and include kids, but they don't know how to do it. The Home Office know that you've got to reduce knife crime, but they don't know how to do it. So what we have to do, Nigel, is demonstrate there is a different way through the models that we set up. The small models in our towns and villages, because they will get picked up and talked about, and this trickle becomes a mighty tide. And that's how change comes in anything.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. I'm Anne Foreman. I'm a former youth worker and a former youth advisor at the Church of England. I was really interested in what you said about what we can do, but I wonder what you would say. One of the things you said was that this is about poverty and class. And one of the real difficulties for the church is that it is so middle class. And we're very good at offering things to people, but not so good at doing things with people. And I wonder what advice you would give the Church of England at the moment.
I would say, you know, the funny thing is, because I'm so old, I'm as old as all the bishops. You know, in fact, they're all my friends. You know, so I talk to them often. I would say this. There's a brilliant book. This is just one starting place. Yeah, there's a brilliant book I'd recommend to you all that was written about 45 years ago, and it's called Christianity Rediscovered. Christianity, and it's written by a Catholic priest called Vincent Donovan, an American. Have some of you read it or heard of it? Yeah? Right. And it's a brilliant book because it's a narrative. It's not an academic book full of concepts, and then you think, well, what do I do with all of that? You know, it's the opposite. He's a Catholic priest who was sent to work with the Maasai. And so he goes and he works on the Catholic compound in a school and a hospital. And he works out that though the Catholic Church has been there for 100 years, working this school, a couple of schools actually, and a hospital, nothing has actually changed for these people. Because what you're doing is something social with them, but there's nothing going up. The internal journey isn't changed. So we are changed. It's the psychosocial, isn't it? It's the spiritual and the outer. You can give people new houses and new jobs and new anything you like, but you've got to change the inner narrative. But you can't do it to them, as you quietly point out. It's no good doing something to them, and that's just colonialism, isn't it? And that's never worked. And so he worked out all of this, and he asked his bishop, and was given permission. He said, I have to leave the compound. I have to stop doing all of this. I can no longer work in the schools and in the hospital. I have to go to the Maasai and live with the Maasai, taking nothing with me, abandoning all of my doctrines and all of my teaching. I have to go and listen to the Maasai and live with them. And I will tell them the story that has motivated me, the story of Jesus. And I will leave that story with them for them to explore it for themselves. It's a brilliant book. He then actually went back to America and he worked in New York as a youth worker. And he says he rediscovered all the same principles with these young people. In the village at St Martin's, we're doing just that. We're working with the kids off the estate. And we plan to start a different kind of church next September, where we just tell people the story of Jesus. We're doing loads of other stuff with them, bands and all the rest of it, you know, all sorts of stuff. Tell them the story of Jesus and let them work together on the principles they want to live by. And we're going to call this The Simple Way, which is linked to a friend of mine who's doing the same type of thing in Philadelphia.
We have a question online, which we'll go to next. This is from Nathan Kiaga, who says, what advice would you give to a church that has an empty church hall or a bit of land which may wish to partner in mission with you?
I'd say you're very lucky. Right? I'd say, well, you can do that with us, but you should do it together. Do you see? So if you've got an empty hall and an empty piece of land, well, you can start, well, let me tell you a story, a real one, So I was walking past an empty rubbish dump 12 years ago. And I was walking past this rubbish dump. When I say rubbish dump, it's a scrap of land in London. It's just under an acre, but it was a rubbish dump. It was running with rats in midday and syringes, and it was completely overgrown. So I guess that this piece of land isn't quite that bad. I was with someone from the local hospital, and I said, this is disgusting. I mean, disease-ridden. And they said, yeah, it's awful. They said, and what's worse is we own it. Honestly true. They wouldn't mind saying it's St Thomas's Hospital in central London. And I said, why don't you do something? They said, we're going to build on it eventually. But a long time, I said, we're walking down a short street, it's called Royal Street. So I said to this person, I said, well, why don't you give it to us until you build on it? What do you want it for? They said, this is only a short street, twice the length of this, well, 3 times the length of this. So I said, quickly, you've got to think of an answer, haven't you? I said, we'll turn it into a farm. They said, will you? And I said, yeah, give it to us on a peppercorn rent. That means you're not actually paying, it's a free rent, a free lease. They said, okay, we'll do it for 5 years. Actually, we've been there 11 years. What we did was we got the community to clear it, and we turned it into Oasis Farm, Waterloo. And we've got growing boxes, and we have 3 goats and some sheep and some, et cetera, and some hens and chickens, and we built a barn there. And what we do is in the barn, well, the community turned it into a wonderful farm. And then all the schools around, we run 2 schools, but all the schools around, we've developed this thing called farming therapy. We've done it for 11 years now because they're still not built on it. In fact, we're just going to move it to a bigger site now at St Martin's, the whole thing. And what happens is all the schools come, and we developed a way of working with kids who don't want to be in a classroom. They can't sit still, and they come in a minibus. The schools actually pay us, right? Because they're responsible for these kids, and they're just smashing up desks and things. But they come to the farm, and they love playing with a guinea pig. I know real farms don't have guinea pigs on, but ours does, etc., etc. A therapeutic guinea pig, etc. And then they grow things, and we have an 8-week course that we've developed where we work with a child to help them understand how their brain is growing, and they're growing synaptic connections. And we help them understand what triggers them flipping, because they don't like the fact that they flip and hit someone or kick a hole in a door. So we explain to them what, we go into, so your prefrontal cortex gets overloaded by your emotional brain. Your prefrontal cortex shuts down as your emotional brain explodes, and that's when you hit something or kick something. And then it takes you about 45 minutes always to calm down, because that's what happens. So we talk them through over an 8-week course, so they leave us knowing more about themselves. Now, if we can do that, then you can do it in your church piece of land. And into the hall, why not invite 3 little local charities to work on this project? Give them shelter. You've got the hall, it's dry. All you're paying for is the heat and the light. Give them shelter and get them working with you, so you can use the outdoor space and the indoor space. And there's an incredible thing I've always found, is when you start something, a crowd attracts a crowd. You know, actually, I've suffered from this all my life. So what Oasis has done, you know, we over the years, literally, we take on empty. You know, I'm a Baptist minister, so I go to. We've done this 5 times. Go to an empty church with no one there, and I say, I'll be your minister for free on Sunday because they've got no money and they can't afford it. As long as you let us have the office, the hall that you don't use as some offices. The only trouble is that once you get stuff going, the church grows. And every time the church grows and then kicks Oasis out because they need, well, you know, we go because they need the rooms. Do something, and when you're doing something, it's amazing. No one's queuing up to come and listen to your prayers and sermons. They are not. Have you realised? You know, it's a minority interest sport. The world does not care, you know, which Sunday after Lent it is. You know, they don't know. They don't want to know. But what they do want is community. What they do want is life. What they do want is to feel purpose and meaning and hope. And whilst I'm on I'm a Baptist, so you preach. Jesus said this. He said, when he was asked, he said, love God with all your heart and soul and mind and love your neighbour as yourself. You know that? And then he said, on these 2 great commandments, which they weren't commandments at all, if you know, rest all of the rest. What he was saying is love God, love your neighbour as yourself, all the rest, don't bother. It's just those 2 core principles. And if you think I'm being flippant with the Bible, I'm not. Paul in Romans says you can sum it all up. The whole law can be summed up as love your neighbour. That's Paul. He reduces it even further than Jesus. And then our churches grow. They do. I know, because it's happened.
We have time for one more question. Okay, we'll take 2 if you're very brief. Please be brief in your responses.
I know, I'm the problem, not you. No,
I'll come to you, Andy, and then if you can pass it straight to the lady behind you. And I think we'll take both questions and then let Steve respond to them together.
Yes, that's
brilliant. Thank you very much, Steve. Inspirational. Thank you. I started out as Andy Mulcox is my name, but I started out as youth worker and now find myself as chair of Multi-Academy Trust, so I can identify with a lot of what you've been saying. And some of what you've said is obviously implied that you'll answer the question, but how do you motivate the church to begin to get much more engaged in the open doors when a Multi-Academy Trust, such as the one I'm involved with, the CEO, would say, please come and partner with us, any church in Exeter across geographical Devon, we'd love to hear from you. How do you go about motivating? Thanks.
Well, I think you've just done it.
Hold on. Let's take both and then you can respond.
Hi, I'm Harriet. Thanks so much, Steve. I've just arrived in Exeter. I suspect I might be the only one here who's under 30, but correct me if I'm wrong. Oh, no, there's another hand over there. Excellent.
2 of you.
I'm just coming into academia, into academic psychology, and working out where I go. I suppose I've got lots of questions for you, but I'll keep them brief. I'll just have one, which is, so we know that the intersection of sort of secular culture when it comes to implementing therapeutic programs or really transformational societal programs that have an impact, the intersection between what the church is doing and what can be implemented by government, sort of local or at a higher level, it is really tricky to navigate, often because we don't have the evidence base, right? So we as Christians and as churches know stuff is working. We see it working. Yeah. But it's, for want of a better word, it's anecdotal or experiential. The Bible Society has recently released some really exciting data about, increased attendance of church, the quiet revival, all of that stuff. How much of your projects that you've been running and your innovations that have come out of Oasis's work have been studied, actually, and researched and written about from, I guess, a scientific method perspective, such that it can then be brought into the wider stage? Does that make sense as a question?
Yes, it does.
Great.
Please respond to whatever you want to about.
Yes, okay. Let me just say about that. The collecting of data and the research in the obvious is a real issue in our society, isn't it? And every new government that comes in, I mean, when everybody changes seats in an existing government and you get a new secretary of this or that, new research projects are set up to research what has already been researched. And that happens all of the time. And often when the research takes place, really very silly things get set up. Do you know, and you'll know all of that. Silly things get set up. So how does Oasis cope with that? One is we work hard to show the impact we're making, do research around impact we're making where we can. The problem is this, that you can't show the impact of a murder that didn't take place. You can't show the impact of a family that didn't break up, that the kid who didn't end up roaming the streets. You can't show that. So do you know the terrible killings that happened in Southport? Do you know those 3 girls? Well, next week to Oasis St Martin's is coming that whole independent research group. I mean, it's a huge number of people on that, and they get a lot of profile. We haven't done any independent research as to why the St Martin's village works. But what happens is, as a model does work, gossip goes round. And the team responsible for that independent piece of research with that huge body on it, they rang up and said, can we come and spend a day at Oasis St Martin's? We spend the morning doing our work. Then they said, will you come and talk to us about community cohesion, and can we spend the afternoon looking round? Now, that's happened simply because what we do works. We can't measure it in the ways that are needed. Perhaps in the end, they'll come and measure it. And anyway, even if we could measure it, we haven't got the money to measure it because we're doing it. And that is the problem for churches and charities, isn't it? You either spend years researching, and of course it's wonderful you can work with a university and get them to do research, but then you haven't got any money either, have you? So I know it's a conundrum, and I haven't answered it well, except to say that Oasis has just pushed through all of that across the country by just getting on. The DFE measure us, the MOJ measure us, everybody else ends up measuring us in the end. But we push through and do what we need to do. But we are mindful that wherever we can do a piece of impact research, we do. In terms of MATS, Multi-Academy Trust, or any school, look, here you are. Here is that. Where is your Multi-Academy Trust? Where are the schools?
Exeter, Plymouth, and across geographical Devon.
Blimey, you see? So you should stand at the door right now, and if you walk out of here and you're involved in a church in Exeter, Plymouth, or wherever, the rest of Devon, and you walk past this man, you're walking past your opportunity of revival. Does that make sense? Like, that's true, isn't it? Because what I have found, you see, again, what I've found, this is that we started this thing at when we started in schools, my trustees board, you know, the board of trustees, they said, you can't do this because you don't know anything about education. Well, I could have told them that, you know. Of course I didn't, because you never know anything about anything until you do it. Descartes was wrong. I'm sorry to say that in a great university like this one, but René Descartes was wrong. He said, you know, I think, therefore I am, the father of the Enlightenment, or one of them. But he was absolutely wrong. That's not because I think I'm cleverer than him. It's because he'd never had the opportunity to use an MRI scanner. You know, you don't think, therefore you are. What actually happened? We all know this now, don't we? A baby cries, and its mother picks it up and cuddles it and gives it some milk. It has an experience, and it reflects on the experience, and it learns. We are having experiences, and we learn from those experiences. How do you grow a church with an empty hall? Well, you can go on endless church growth courses and it will produce absolutely nothing, let me tell you. Or you can get this man's email address and plunge in to a little bit of mentoring, or with another academy, mat or school, and it will be amazing. I will guarantee you people will join your church just because you give purpose to them and they can get involved. How do I know that? Because I led churches all my life. That's how they grow.
Thank you so much, Steve. I'm sorry to have to interrupt our conversations. You didn't let me down. You didn't look at the floor and not say anything. Thank you so much. It falls to me as the director of Accept to thank you on behalf of Accept for being here and accepting this invitation. If you don't already know about Accept, the Exeter Centre for Ethics and Practical Theology, please grab me before you go and I will tell you more. I would also like to say a really personal thank you to Steve because I studied theology with Oasis long before I ever studied it in the university on my gap year 20 mumble years ago. So there's probably quite a direct connection really between what I did then and you know us being in the room this evening. So thank you for that. I've also been asked by Trevor to trail next year's Posbury St Francis lecture, while this one is still fresh in your minds and you think, how brilliant. So roughly this time next year, please look out for the publicity. We're pleased to announce that our lecturer will be Professor Mark Hill, KC, who will be addressing issues in the somewhat topical area of human rights. Provisional date the 5th of October 2026, but please watch this space. But meanwhile, everyone in the room, everyone online, would you please join me once again in thanking very much our Posbury St Francis lecturer for this year, Reverend Steve Chalke. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.